Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll let everyone into the webinar and get started in just a few seconds. All right, thank you all again for joining us today. Welcome to the Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. Today's webinar is Farming for Monarchs, How Monarch Habitat and Ag Can Coexist. Our presenters today are Brittany Smith, Habitat Program Manager, and Jake Koenig, Midwest Habitat Program Manager here at MJV. My name is Jenna Tots. I'm MJV Online Education Manager, and I'm joined by my coworker, Alyssa Taylor, MJV Program Coordinator. We begin today by honoring the land on which we live and work. The offices of the Monarch Joint Venture are located in St. Paul and Belle Plaine, Minnesota, and we acknowledge that this land is the traditional homelands of the Dakota people, specifically the Mdewakanton Dakota, who have lived here for generations and continue to live here today. We recognize the enduring presence and contributions of Dakota and Ojibwe nations across Minnesota. You can go to native-land.ca, Native Land Digital, an Indigenous-led nonprofit organization, to see a digital map of Indigenous territories, languages, and treaties in your area. We also want to thank our sponsor for their support of this webinar. Our supporting sponsor is Reinvent Your Waste. We appreciate your support and dedication to monarch conservation. If you or your company is interested in sponsoring next year, please email learn@monarchjointventure.org. Before we get started today, just a few community guidelines and helpful hints. If you're joining us today but didn't pre-register, we want to count you for attendance, send you our follow-up email later this week. Please email learn@monarchjointventure.org with your name, city, and state. This webinar will be recorded and posted on our website by Friday of this week. The entire Monarch Conservation Webinar archive is free and available to watch. It contains over 10, I think 11 years worth of Monarch Conservation webinars. It's organized by category, so find something that interests you and give it a watch. During the webinar, please put your questions in the Q&A box. This is found on the bottom screen of your Zoom. We'll collect all of those at the end and do a Q&A with our speakers. Please don't use the chat for questions, just easier for us to keep track of things in the Q&A. Use reactions during the presentation. Also, if you look at the bottom black bar of your Zoom, you can see reactions and you can put those in during the speaker's presentation. Very fun. Thank you. Good practice. Just fun to be able to interact on this webinar. Otherwise, it's kind of difficult to do that. We want to remind you that there are also translated captions for this Zoom call. If you'd like to add captions in a language other than English, you can click on the arrow that says captions. Be sure that the translation button is on and then choose your caption language. And usually I would say that our webinar speakers represent their own viewpoints, which are not necessarily those of the MJV, but we've got our own folks today, so let me introduce them. Brittany provides habitat technical assistance to landowners throughout the Eastern Monarch Central Flyway. Her work focuses on supporting managers of private working lands and regional agricultural stakeholders to create, restore, and sustain pollinator habitat. She received a BS in Fisheries and Wildlife and a Master's in Natural Resources Management, both from North Dakota State University. Her career in conservation has taken her all over the Central Flyway, first specializing in wetland ecology and restoration in both private consulting and with USDA NRCS, and more recently with Pheasants Forever and Quail Forever. Shifting gears to focus on helping farmers analyze the costs of farming things like wetlands and evaluating habitat conservation program options to improve their bottom line while also protecting those environmentally sensitive areas. She enjoys fishing, hiking, and nature photography, and managing specialty crops on her family farm in west central Minnesota in her spare time. And Jake Koenig, as our Midwest Habitat Program Manager. Jake provides technical assistance to landowners throughout the Midwest and Central Flyway states as a priority, but the entire Eastern Monarch population as a whole. His work focuses on supporting the MJV with the strategic development of MJV's habitat programs and all habitat-related inquiries, as well as providing guidance to managers of private working lands, state and federal agencies, corporations, and beyond to create, restore, and sustain pollinator habitat. Jake was born and raised in a small town in Nebraska and enjoys working with landowners to balance agricultural operations and quality wildlife habitat. He attended the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, receiving a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife biology, as well as a minor in environmental education. Jake has supported the implementation and maintenance of habitat projects for over a decade. He is an avid outdoorsman and thoroughly enjoys the companionship of his 2 Labrador retrievers, Nova and Nix. He's very passionate about habitat conservation. So on that note, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it over to our amazing presenters today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenna.
Of course.
Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon and taking some time out of your day to listen in. This is a topic that, is pretty popular. We get asked a lot of questions from actually, private working landowners and farmers, but we also get a lot of inquiries from folks that are not private landowners or farmers. And that's where we're going to address a lot of those looming questions and just some things to consider and think about. We've titled this today, Farming for Monarchs. We're not necessarily out there harvesting monarchs in any way, right? Not like our corn and soybeans, but we're farming with the idea of benefits for habitat and monarchs in our mind in this landscape. And we want to figure out how exactly monarchs and other pollinators in agriculture can coexist. So we're going to kind of go through a lot of different things today. And we want to start with, why does working with agriculture matter, right? It's here to stay. It's supportive of, our growing population as humans. It also supports a variety of other, livestock needs and feed there. But as you can see, it's a money game, and it contributes about $1 trillion per year to our U.S. economy. It really is the main kind of job and predominant employer or supporter of our local rural communities. So there's a lot of money invested by these local landowners to support these local communities in this, in the Midwest, and kind of the breadbasket or the corn and soybean belt that you would think of. And one thing we really want to look at too is the statistic at the bottom there in that bullet point. 2/3 of the land in the lower 48 states is privately owned. And much of that is, working ag land, whether that's row crop or pasture or livestock grazed. It really is working lands. And that's a super important thing to think about, because if you think about where we prioritize a lot of our work, it is in those green spaces on this map, you'll see. And the other third that's publicly owned, it kind of it follows roughly kind of that Rocky Mountain stretch, where, it's not necessarily a priority area of where we typically see monarchs or high quality monarch habitat, right? And you'll see that obviously the Western population in California, and then in other Western states, and then the Eastern population kind of in these green density areas. And that really dovetails nicely, because we need to focus our work in these areas, where it's a priority to have the highest quality habitat. And this we'll kind of touch on, the different segmented populations. Here is the Eastern monarch population and agriculture. They did a study here. On the left, you'll see a map from Flockhart et al. In 2017. They took some stable isotopes, and they found basically the natal origins of where these monarchs were coming from. And you'll see that 38% of those monarchs are kind of in that dark green area. That's where they originated or they come from, right? And you'll notice, it's not coincidence, but that map on the right shows those acres that are heavily corn and soybean acres in the Midwest. So there's direct overlap there. That's why it's extremely important that we find a way to work with these landowners to implement habitat on their operations and really kind of meet them in the middle, and consider new innovative approaches to how we can go about conservation on these lands. And it's not to say that those other regions are not important, because they are, right? They're all additive to this. But as far as the monarch breeding range goes, those Midwest states are super important, especially when we consider that, most of these Midwestern states are, again, predominantly privately owned. I'm in Nebraska, for instance, it's 97% privately owned, and that's really consistent with the map you saw in the previous slide of a lot of these Midwest states. They're heavily privately owned, so we got to work with them in order to get this work done. And contrary to that, kind of the western population, they're west of the Rocky Mountains. There's a lot of agriculture going on in California, especially in the Central Valley. It supplies about 25% of the United States fruit and nut crops. If you enjoy almonds or take part in really nice fresh fruit in kind of the off season here in the Midwest, they're there to support us there. So super important. It's worth about $60 billion as of 2023. I'm sure that number has increased with inflation and some other things. So super important to the economy. And it encompasses about 20,000 square miles. You'll see kind of in that red polygon overlaid in the state of California. So it's a significant chunk in a place that, in a state that's pretty large. It accounts for a pretty large area. California itself is 27 million acres cropland and about 16 million acres of grazing land. So there is a lot of agriculture going on in California, which might be contrary to some other folks' belief. But you can see the Central Valley lies right in the heart between where those Western monarchs are overwintering and ultimately where they're going during their breeding season. And it's a huge contributor to that population with its resources in the Central Valley. And I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Brittany, and she's going to take over on some of these challenges and some innovative things that we're doing in this landscape.
Thanks, Jake. Yes, I will tackle the fun task here of walking us through some of the challenges that we face in agricultural production systems when we're dealing with monarchs and other pollinators. If my slides will go, there we go. The first thing that most people probably think of is just this one-to-one sort of conversion of grassland to row crop ag, which is a consideration. It is a threat. It is a challenge that monarchs and other pollinators, other wildlife species face, because this map here is a retrospective sort of look at the period from 2008 to 2016. When commodities prices were really inflated, they were very high. And so we saw a lot of conversion of grassland to new row crop acres. And this study was published in 2020. So we have seen some emerging land use trends that are also influencing monarchs and sort of dovetail into this agricultural conversion trend as well. And that's why it says urban trends on this slide, and we'll get into that in a second. But here's also that retrospective look at how this impacted monarch habitat specifically. So we obviously lost a fair bit of milkweed by percentage, in that conversion of grassland to row crops. And, with that coincided a reduction in stem density of milkweeds in the Midwest. But since 2020, so this is a more recent study that's looking at, projected land use trends. We are also facing this increasing crunch from urban sprawl. So we see that here on the left. This is high density urban development, projected over time how this is going to increase from 50,000 to many more. We have 1,400,000 acres on the top end here in Texas, where we expect to see, urban expansion. But the biggest changes that we anticipate seeing are really in this low density residential space, because we are seeing people, with work from home and COVID, moving back out from cities to more rural and just urban or ex-urban development. So we're moving back out to the suburbs, moving to rural communities, and we're going to have to build, housing and other infrastructure to support that, schools, all the things that go along with people, right? So that's something to consider here. So it's sort of twofold, where if we go back, actually, I'll take us back to this first slide, because we see some of these teal or blue-green areas, however these show up on your screen, where we have actually seen cropland abandonment. I think abandonment is probably not quite the right word. We're probably seeing, sale or conversion to another land use. And if we look at, where we're seeing a lot of this happen, it's because we're having urban development in those areas. And so as we keep sort of expanding our population outward from cities, we're converting increasingly marginal areas. That was one of the main takeaways from this 2020 study. We took a look here at the yield differential. So projected yield differential for 3 different crops, primary crops in the East, corn, soy, and wheat, versus the national average and then local averages. So yields on these crop grounds that were recently converted were significantly lower. We're seeing between the 2.5% and 5% below local averages across most of these local maps for all 3 of those crops. We have some exceptions where we had some conversion to wheat in West Texas, but other than that, locally, it's pretty hit or miss. I would say it's mostly a miss. And so we have to think about, is this economically viable and ecologically viable? And how can we do better? So another thing people don't think about as much when we talk about habitat loss is just habitat quality degradation. We did a webinar earlier this summer on fire and just sort of grasslands 101. And one of the primary things we talked about was woody encroachment. So the movement of woody species into our grassland areas because of lack of management. So people tend to think of humans, we think of ourselves as separate from nature, when really, in this country and globally, nature evolved alongside us, humans evolved alongside nature, and humans really played a large active stewardship role in these plant communities. So, we were intentionally setting fires. The indigenous people had many different land uses and things that they were actively managing for. And so now that we've sort of taken this tack of fire suppression over active management, we're starting to see, large scale invasion by woody species into what should be historically grass and wildflowers, which is important for grassland species like monarchs that need flowers to thrive. But we're also seeing other things creep in. We've had a large number of non-native species introduced. We have things like old world bluestem in the southern plains here. We have the golden hills of California that are not supposed to be golden. Those are all, non-native invasive annual grasses that have monoculture taken over and displaced the native plant communities there. And we have other things like Kentucky bluegrass. It's a long grass that has escaped and is capable of invading our even relatively intact native cool season, cool climate grasslands in the northern plains here. So a lot of this has to do with lack of management, but there is also the added fun aspect of managing for invasive species here. And another driver of habitat loss in ag systems is just how dramatically the scale of farming has changed over the last 50 years. So because farming implements are so much bigger now, we have seen a lot of field consolidation, where previously we had a lot of small fields that had a lot of, edge habitat, essentially in the fence rows and the windbreaks, that are being consolidated into larger and larger field sizes because it takes so much more effort to turn some of this equipment around. So I have my 1970s 6-row Alice Chalmers planter for an example here, versus, a modern air seeder setup. So the scale matters when we're talking about implements and efficiency. So it makes more sense for them to take those fence rows out and go in a straight line than to make a bunch of turns. And another thing that we've, if you're on this webinar, probably all well aware of are, the potential agrochemical impacts from things that we use in conventional agricultural systems. So we have non-target species mortality, which is the sciencey way of saying we accidentally kill things we don't mean to when we spray insecticides in field. Monarchs are predominantly impacted by drift from foliar applications. So when we're managing for other insect pest species in crop fields, monarchs are an unintentional side effect that we can hit if that application is drifting off field where it's not supposed to be. And herbicides, there's a compounding effect. They don't directly kill monarchs, but they reduce the availability of flowering plants in field or next to field, where historically some of those weedy species, when we used to farm a little less clean before the intervention of these agrochemicals, a lot of those weedy species are flowering and providing some nectar resources in field. But wait, there's more. In case you're thinking we were going to get into things getting better here. Nope. There are more challenges for us in terms of infrastructure. So, we have to consider farming as a business, and farmers have to have markets. If we are farming at this scale, we're going to be reliant on the local infrastructure supporting our crop systems. So, we see this sort of regional infrastructure and demand surrounding specific cropping systems like corn and soy in the Midwest, sorghum and winter wheat in the Southern Plains. We got cotton and peanuts in Texas and the Southeast, and then all those specialty crops like Jake was talking about in California, the Central Valley. And farmers need markets because they either have to be able to sell their product direct to consumer, at a farmer's market or at some other venue where they're selling directly to you, or whatever other end consumer of their product, or more likely they're, a member of a co-op where the co-op's employing people who then have the ability to turn around and, market that grain, because it's basically a full-time job. It's asking a lot of farmers to do direct sales. And especially on this scale of operation that we're, thinking here, like commercial almond production or commercial corn production, that'd be a lot of work to find individual buyers. And so another alternative is that they have a relationship with a bulk buyer. But, it's hard to tell somebody where the co-op or bulk buyers local to them are buying corn and soy to, just grow canola. That'd be great if there was a buyer. But that's one of those infrastructure pieces that we have to consider. And, thinking back to the last slide, 2 slides ago, when we were talking about equipment, all that equipment is incredibly specialized and very expensive. When we're looking at a new John Deere combine, for example, we're talking about $750,000 at the low end to over $1 million, like $1.1, $1.2 million for a brand new John Deere combine. What's the likelihood if I just purchased brand new equipment that I'm going to completely change my mode of production? It's probably pretty limited. Those are financial considerations that farmers need to make. And then there's also this consideration of like, just shift to organic production. And I think people don't realize how time consuming organic certification can be. It is also potentially expensive. And there are like USDA programs, state programs that can help offset some of those costs, but it is still in some cases a years-long process to actually transition to a fully organic certified operation. And so it really just isn't all this to say. It's really not that simple as just do something different, grow something else. All of these things have to fall into place to support this type of systemic change. We have to have policy in place. The systems supporting agriculture have to change. Our markets have to change. We have to have on and off farm infrastructure. It's not just the on-farm infrastructure either. We have to have the ability to transport, process whatever we're doing with those crops once they leave the farm field. So storage, also a consideration. But there is good news, I promise. So let's do a little bit of a deep dive. So back to what Jake was saying, working lands are obviously, they provide a tremendous opportunity for us to plug in and just do better on some scale because they cover such a massive land area. So if we look at this map, the bulk of it is brown and yellow, which are row crop and grazing lands. And so, either it's involved directly in row crop production or livestock production. And those are systems that we can work with to make change. And one of the ways we can do that, it's not just, I like to say things like when people question our ability to make technological advancements, like, well, when I was a kid, my teacher used to say you won't have a calculator in your pocket, so you're definitely going to need to know your times tables, which, okay, fair, you should. But guess what I do have in my pocket? I don't just have a calculator. I have like all of human knowledge. So farming has seen the same sort of revolution in tech in the last 30 years, but certainly in the last 10 years, as we've started to apply some of, our computer tech and software programs in field. So one of the biggest revolutions for farming is the advent of GPS-enabled yield mapping technology. So this allows us to produce these field maps for producers, which we can look at over time to identify areas in field that are not functioning very well, right? We're not seeing the yields that we are relative to the rest of the field. And so then we can go back and also do math to say, hey, this is what you spent on fertilizer, on insecticide, on diesel, just making passes, to get this planted, get it harvested, whatever. We can look at all your inputs, and then we can say, hey, you're actually losing money farming some of these areas. And so those unprofitable or ROI negative areas, then, we can look at by contrast, what might you either make on a conservation program if we're talking about something like CRP, which has an annual payment, the Conservation Reserve Program, or just if you're losing money annually farming something, you're better off not farming it, right? Like you're going to make money by not spending money. So even if we just are putting it in to sort of a one-time payment upfront program, right? We might be winning over the long term in that field, looking at some of these red areas, right? And so I will say also this map comes from a tech that is available to retrofit basically any combine. So yes, we can spend $1 million on a new John Deere and have Op Center and all this really fancy, bells and whistles, all this technology at our fingertips, but we don't have to. Farm Trucks is one of these technological wonders that allows us to, access this technology for like $3,000 as opposed to $1 million. So there are options, within just about every farm budget to start to capture some of this data. But even if you don't want to spend $3,000, we can still help you get sort of a picture of what's going on in field. These are free tools. There are many different platforms. There are companies that'll come out and fly drones to collect some of this imagery as well. And typically what we're looking at is this NDVI, which is the normalized difference vegetation index, which is a measure of plant health relative to the rest of the field. So we can, again, take a look at these images over time and, identify trends where it's like this area in field, probably not yielding very well for you. Let's talk about, what options might be, especially if it's like a wet spot and you're getting stuck in it all the time, or it's sandy, it's salty, there's something else happening there. Like, let's just not bother with that anymore. And we don't necessarily need to do the full financial deep dive, but we can also look at, general input math and still kind of get you a picture even without your exact yield data. And I think it's great that some of these tools exist for even specialty crops. So like this is a vineyard in California that we still have this imagery available for. We can do other nut crops, pecans, almonds. We can do, your bog standard corn, soy, obviously, sorghum, wheat. It's a great tool for management. And, viticulture is probably the oddball because maybe grapes were like, hey, this is maybe your best tasting wine where it's the most stressed. Let's consider some other use where it's, a little too friendly for grapes. Grapes are the outlier there for making wine anyway. But other innovations largely center around integrated pest management. So technology is great because we have all of these new tools available to us that allow us to reduce our input costs in other ways where we're actually reducing just the inputs themselves. So we can do variable rate application of things like fertilizer, seed, pesticides, and irrigation water. And then the advent of drone spraying is also really big for reducing drift to those non-target species like monarchs, because we don't have the prop wash that we do if we're like helicopter spraying. It's much more accurate or targeted than airplane spraying, and we can send out we can do sort of a preemptive survey, send out the drone to map where we see problem areas in the field, and then send it back out to actually go spray each one of those areas once we have a boundary mapped. And then this last point here, this is since 2018. There's a company called Blue River that is partnering now with John Deere, and they're using camera-equipped spray booms and machine learning that is capable of identification and spraying at the same time. So we're IDing weeds in the field and spraying them selectively and individually in the field. So having these capabilities is dramatically, it has the potential to dramatically reduce drift of insecticides, other pesticides. And so you may be wondering, well, okay, what does irrigation have to do with monarchs? How does that help monarchs? Precision irrigation. This is one of those tools that we can make really detailed maps for producers and help them understand where in field they need to target more or less water. And that in and of itself may not benefit monarchs directly, but it does help communities, right? We talk about places like the Central Valley in California, places like the Southern Plains over the Ogallala Aquifer that are seeing dramatic declines in available water. We have to be water conscious, and this is one of those new tools that is helping us to do that. But also when we do go and plug some of this other data in and make a profitability map, we oftentimes see that the pivot corners, the areas surrounding the center pivot, are ROI negative. They're not profitable. You're losing money farming them. It's not always the case, but we do see this frequently. And so having this information can really help us do conservation planning, because these are great opportunities for perennial habitat. So I got my trusty longhorn bees sleeping next to my my center pivot. This is a habitat planting out in western Kansas, and we really do see great results, great use by other species, quail, songbirds, etc., in these pivot corners too. So basically, everybody wins when we start to use some of these tech tools. And with that, I will kick it back over to Jake to do a deep dive into how we can continue to coexist.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, no, I love hearing Brittany talk about that. She has a ton of experience, coming from her past roles and doing a lot of work with precision ag in that realm. So always fascinating to hear those challenges and the innovations that we're coming up with nowadays to, tackle some of these hurdles. Because there's a lot of questions. You're like, okay, man, how does this work? That's all fine and dandy, but how do monarchs and these farms for profit coexist on the landscape? And there's a lot of ways we can do this that have co-benefits for the producers and the communities alike. And so we just really got to sit down. And a lot of times what happens, the very first thing that comes out of our mouth is, well, not much. Usually we're listening to the landowner first. And we're just really trying to basically piece apart what are their objectives, right? We know what our objectives are going into the conversation from a conservation standpoint, but we want to know, okay, what are they actually trying to do here? What are their priorities? So we look at those things like Brittany's mentioned, paying attention to the available water. Water quantity is huge, especially in different parts of the United States and the world in general. You look at the Central Valley, having that water available is very important for not only the crops, but for the community, for other things. You get into kind of my neck of the woods, you've got tri-state things going on that can be pretty heated when it comes to available water. You know, you got Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas there. So it's a touchy subject, and we got to be paying attention to our water use. And so maybe they want to reduce that to become a better steward of the land. Soil health and carbon markets, you know, there's emerging markets there. We'll get into these a little bit more in these next slides, but water quality, again, some more emerging markets there. And who doesn't want clean water, right? For our people and for the things that we produce. That's an obvious one. Crop pollination is oftentimes a goal of certain landowners with certain crops. And then, you know, we've got some that people don't always think of, but a lot of times these landowners have a big interest in recreation or purely aesthetic value. So those are just some of the goals that we often talk about when we're meeting with these landowners. And so, you know, you might be wondering, how exactly do we meet these landowners where they're kind of standing while also addressing our conservation goals from maybe a monarch or pollinator or other species standpoint? And, you know, we always like to say, you know, you're like, well, it could always be better, right? Your project could always be better. Well, that's not perfect. And if you talk to us long enough, you're going to hear us say, we don't like to make perfect the enemy of good, right? We like to say yes to these projects. We really like to learn from them, and we want to be working, you know, to have these co-benefits with these producers and these landowners. And so Brittany already kind of mentioned using integrated pest management, which is that IPM. And you know, that might look like, you know, difference in your chemical application schedule or chemical application products, or maybe it's just timing, right? Timing is huge. And maybe it's not just chemicals, maybe it's mowing management, and just tweaking those things just a little bit on an operation can really have a pretty big impact. And so that's one way we do it. Another way we do it is a lot of perennial edge of field practices or even in-field practices. We'll dive into these a little bit further, but you got prairie strips, field borders, grass waterways, stream buffers, pivot corners. Those are just to list a few. Those are all perennial options for these landowners to consider whether they use a program or not. And then, you know, we've got some other things that we can look into, like cover cropping for pollinators, especially for those folks that do have livestock or cattle on their operation. And so we kind of mentioned this. I'm just going to break these down a little bit more with these edge of field practices. This is probably one a lot of you have seen. It's a really popular one in Iowa, coming out of the Iowa State University here. And that's the Prairie Strips CP43 Conservation Reserve Program, or CRP program, practice. You know, it's a really popular one over there. It started to catch traction throughout the Midwest. It is a continuous practice. I'm going to try not to get too deep into these programs and practices, because we could have our own webinar and talk literally all day about those options. But just know that there's a lot of practices out there that have a pollinator priority in their design, and they're really built to allow the flexibility and ease of use on the farm for these landowners so they can enroll, you know, multiple different areas. But, you know, beyond that, there's a lot of different programs: environmental quality incentives program, EQIP, the conservation stewardship program, CSP. They all have different practices. There's a ton of different options in there to really make these farms, these landowners' operations more efficient, and also provide natural resource benefits. So there's just some really cool statistics with these prairie strips, which is totally equals a win for these farmers, right? So if every one of these landowners put 10% of their field into prairie strips, they would see a 95% reduction in sediment loss, 90% reduction in phosphorus loss, 85% reduction in nitrogen loss through surface runoff. And this is according to Iowa State studies. So, I mean, that's pretty significant, right? When it comes to our soil health, our water quality, our costs per acre, and design and use with these landowners. but it's also supporting insect predators of these crop pests, right? So in the field or nearby, we're attracting the beneficial insects to kind of rid or help rid you of some of those undesirable species. And you may improve crop pollination if your crop warrants that kind of a thing.
I will chime in here and say that there is research that indicates even our, quote unquote, wind pollinated crops, corn and soy, benefit, at least the areas adjacent to these prairie strips benefit from the implementation of basically just having floral resources available for pollinators. Your crop also benefits because they're still visiting corn and soy, even though they are supposedly primarily wind pollinated. So they're still seeing yield gains and crop quality benefits at some level. There's a lot to tease out there, but there is research that even our Midwest poor crops benefit. So interesting.
Absolutely.
Aside.
No, that's a good point to bring up too. And then this is just kind of prairie strips continued, some more wins here, some benefits. There was a 2017 study that found that these strips raised pollinator abundance by 3.5 times and native bird species by over 2 times. So that's pretty significant on these landscapes that and a lot of times can be pretty void of a lot of, wildlife or biodiversity in general. Again, just another feather in our hat or another opportunity for these landowners to consider. We're always promoting our native species, our native bees and native pollinators, but honeybees are their own livestock essentially. And this study shows that these honeybee colonies in prairie strips collected 50% more pollen. And you can imagine, our native species are seeing very similar benefits. It's a little bit harder to measure that. But it's, again, it's another opportunity, another commodity for these landowners to offer if they're interested in honey production. And this comes up a lot too. There's a lot of studies out there, but there was one done in 2024 around neonicotinoids, these insecticides, and they're found that there's really no increased risk to pollinators within these prairie strip zones. So that's a pretty fascinating study and, one that more people should know about. This is a good aerial image of just kind of some of those on-farm or edge of field practices that a landowner was using, courtesy of Doug Doty here. And it looks like, they probably did use the CP43 program. In this instance, you can kind of see there's, 2 skinny linear plots within the field, which would be kind of those areas. Maybe there's a sand lens or it's very rocky or maybe it's wet in that bottom. And that's why I wanted to put those in. And you'll see that kind of coupled with what we would consider a traditional field border or a CP33 around the perimeter of that field. It's a certain width there. But the nice thing about the CP43 is you can couple those together all as one practice. So it's less confusing upon enrollment. But again, we can get into that in a totally another webinar. This is another option for us too, especially when it comes to our water quality. This is what I would consider traditionally a filter strip. In places like Minnesota, they have the required buffer law. So your Reinvest in Minnesota program there, where a lot of these buffers do exist, right? And they're acting as filters for sedimentation, for some of these nutrient load concerns, but they're also providing a lot of benefit for habitat, right? There's a lot of diversity that we can find. And the reason we find a lot of that diversity is because that water exists where it does. And that can be really important when we discuss monarch conservation, these travel corridors, and where we can find some of these really high quality nectar resources. It's going to be near the water, especially when we have dry years. We actually do have some funding within MJV from the Board of Water and Soil folks in Minnesota, where we're going to be kind of working on enhancement or restoration of some of these existing filter strip areas. And then this is just kind of another emerging opportunity. We're starting to see some of this pay for pay for performance water quality outcomes. This comes from Maryland and Virginia specifically, but there's opportunities for us to collaborate to enhance these buffers along these waterways, but also consider biodiversity in the design and in the management of those areas. So the basically higher performance or value that these habitats are providing, a higher quality incentive you would receive. And then another really good one that's, aligns with a lot of our producers' goals, especially those that have cattle, is cover crops. And this is a program we've been working within MJV for the last 2 years. We ran a pilot full season cover crop program that we offered to folks throughout the Midwest. And we learned a lot of things, and we're still learning things, but it's been really receptive to our landowners, and we've seen some really good success with the diversity that we've included in that mix. There's 29 species in that mix alone, so it's pretty crazy, and we've made it pretty budget friendly. But we're also providing, a pretty significant amount of biomass there with a forage production interest. So we're getting folks using that. We've had a great response from pollinators, monarch butterflies, and a slew of other wildlife. So it's been really good. We've focused a lot with, certified seed corn isolation acres. They have to have a required buffer area where these cover crops might be an opportunity, especially where small grains are not as popular or used in the southern states or areas where we do have more small grains. We like to consider cover crops on these fallow acres. But then we're also considering dryland pivot corners, or even folks that have traditionally kind of leased acres out to be farmed that's nearby, perennial wildlife areas, just because they want kind of a food plot. That's been another option for people to consider. So it's been really good, and we're trying to get some more traction there. And it's just another conversation we can have with these folks who might not want to have, a perennial habitat or have the area to do that. They can do kind of an annual option.
I can personally attest that it's also cow candy. We've been grazing ours. We have, I know on my bio said specialty crop manager, but we drove a cow-calf operation and implemented this as a test and grazed cattle on it. And I mean, they loved it. Our calves were sneaking under the hot wire to go graze in there. So multiple benefits.
You're always sending me pictures of them thinking the grass is greener on the other side, and it is.
It literally is. Yeah, they love it.
And then again, we mentioned it briefly before with trying to, just align our conservation goals with a lot of the landowners' objectives. And, farming is their business, of course. They spend a lot of their time on their property working and managing it. But, that's also a lot of the places where they recreate, right? That's where they're spending a lot of time, and they want to have those opportunities. And so hunting is a pretty big one. And so we really like to have, overlapped designs there, or maybe it's just bird watching. Both of these photos are from projects that were previously row cropped acres, and you'll note in both photos there's water in the background of both of them. So it's a pretty key component to a lot of the places where we do these high quality projects. But just that aesthetic value and maybe just wildlife watching in general is oftentimes a pretty big objective on these unproductive or marginal acres that folks can put back into high quality habitat. And that's really all we got. I mean, we spent a lot of time rambling at you. Hopefully we didn't take up too much time. I know we mentioned some other opportunities with some future webinars on grazing or conservation programs, but yeah, that was kind of our row crop ag and monarchs spiel.
Fantastic, both of you. I absolutely love when I get to hear more about from our Habitat crew. So thank you personally, but also from the 150 people we've got online right now. I really enjoyed just learning about the flexibility that farmers have. That was something that I was not aware of. So that was just really, really interesting in my little takeaway. But we've got some questions, so let's dive in. How much of, and this is connected, but a little tangential, but how much of corn, soy, and wheat is fed to livestock as opposed to feeding people directly? Just as a
Great
little
question.
snippet.
And so, I mean, I would say the majority of those products is for animal consumption. The human consumption is less of a percent, and obviously it depends on the crop itself, but they're both equally important, right? Full circle.
And really we've surpassed, it's not even, if we're talking about corn specifically, the primary use of corn at this point is for corn ethanol. It's not even livestock or human consumption. So there are other structural policy, market factors in play there. That's a good question. But yeah, recognizing that most of these things are not directly consumed by humans.
Yes.
Thank you. How can we effectively educate farmers about this new technology?
I don't think they need us to educate them. They're getting all this marketing from all angles. They're getting it from John Deere, from their crop consultants, from every farming magazine they pick up, or even at the livestock auction place, wherever they're talking to their neighbor. The tech piece they're aware of. Whether or not, I think it's a generational shift, probably a generational mindset shift. And as we see younger people coming into farming, we see a change in tech adoption rates, obviously. So
awesome. One of the flexible options was grassed waterways. What are grassed waterways?
Yeah, so they're typically in field areas that have concern of heavy erosion or head cutting or something like that. So the design practice is often a little bit different. You can use a prairie strip in that scenario with a larger, more robust design, but a lot of folks use those grass waterways where they plant really high seeding rates. It is more grass dominated because the conservation concern there is soil holding objectives. So it is an option we can add some diversity on. We've done some diverse grass waterways. They just serve a different kind of resource concern.
Is there different equipment requirements to put in prairie strips?
Not really. It's pretty much the same, but I will say in designing some of those CP43 fields in the past, you really kind of want to sit down with the landowner and figure out, the equipment that they're using and if it makes sense to most efficiently harvest and plant around those areas while still, again, meeting their resource concerns.
And those are really great options. So kind of thinking back to that field border photo, if we know the width of your equipment, then we can plan the width of our field border or whatever odd area. If we're taking something out to square up a field, we can improve your farming efficiency with that in mind, right? Like you can make fewer passes if you have a wonky field width or something happening. So
Like a fun game of Tetris, if you will.
a little bit. Yeah.
Awesome. I know you talked a little bit about the pay for performance water quality outcomes in the East. This person says our prairie strips primarily used in the Midwest. I live in Virginia, and I'm wondering what practices are currently being used in our area.
Yeah. So go ahead, Brittany. Sorry.
Well, I was just thinking Virginia, last year was your first year for this sort of pay for performance program, and it was a grant program, I believe, in its inception. So they are looking at ways, they have some first projects hitting the ground now that were different types of applications. They're looking at total, nutrient reduction hitting the Chesapeake Bay. But in Maryland, we have been working with Shore Rivers, whose infographic I kind of shared of their project, and they're doing some flexible with buffers with producers and doing this pay for performance model as well. But we can certainly build things that are based on the prairie strips practice, but it should be available. You know, if you talk to your USDA office about CP43, it should be available everywhere.
Yeah, I know it does vary as far as practices in each state that I know and have their own priorities, but it is catching more and more traction. It is predominantly used throughout the Midwest, just where it's been more popular, but I think it is expanding and should be an option soon for you.
Yeah, and there are options, you know, independent of USDA, I guess where I was going with that. Like we can help plan things, or our partners can, because that's sort of the work that they're doing for water quality, but
For sure.
yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Do you have statistics to show the prairie strips are reducing pesticide use and increasing production by crop type?
I mean, it's very hard. I mean, the preliminary data that I've seen is, we'll address the last part of that first. So, you know, bumps in yield. We know that there is an effect. How far into field it goes is the question. Definitely the areas adjacent to prairie strips, for soy and corn, have in multiple cases demonstrated some gains, you know, but replicating across studies, I think we would need to do a lot of research to figure out exactly what are the gains per crop. We don't have that data yet. Just sort of beginning stages of curating that information. And then as far as reducing pesticide use, I think we're at this place, you know, where we have all of this technology available, and prairie strips are certainly one option for us to address, you know, water quality as well as these biodiversity outcomes, but it's not the prairie strips themselves that are going to influence pesticide usage. You know, it's what else are we doing in field? But presumably if we're installing prairie strips with a producer, they're probably pretty aware of what is happening in field and working to reduce their pesticide application, or operate, you know, on that more integrated pest management kind of mindset.
Yeah, I know there's for sure one study specific to soybeans with that scenario, both of those shown, but we'd have to dig it up.
Cool. If you find it, we'll put it in the email that goes out later.
Sounds good.
Speaking of studies, can we get the 2024 neonic study that you were talking about?
Yep,
Awesome.
we can link it in the, yep.
Yep, we'll email that. And with that, kind of connected to that, how can there be no neonic risk to pollinators and prairie strips in glyphosate sprayed crops?
Well, glyphosate's not a neonic, so rest assured, like these are different classes of compound. And, you know, I think there's a misunderstanding probably of how most neonics are used in row crop ag, at least, you know, in this sort of prairie strips conversation. We're talking about neonic seed treatment, and maybe like an in-furrow application. So it's like applied directly in soil if there is another application of a neonic. And so there's not this sort of like broad foliar spray application happening for neonics. So the concern with neonics and pollinators is transfer. Basically in this situation, what they were looking at was like how much is accumulating in the plant tissue from the nearby field via that runoff that the prairie strips are intercepting, and what are those prairie plants taking up that could then be impacting caterpillars. And what they found was that across the board, neonic levels were not reaching any kind of concern threshold, or toxicity threshold for pollinators. And so that's one of the reassuring things, I think, coming out of some of this research. And there's more to learn. I mean, there's more to learn as we are ever evolving in our tech capabilities too. And it'll be interesting to get more data, you know, going forward about foliar applied insecticides and how that drift looks in prairie strips. But for right now, I'm encouraged by the neonic conversation. So
yeah, and we do have a handout that kind of dives into that a little bit more in depth to go through it a little bit deeper.
mm-hmm.
Great. Well,
And, to also address that glyphosate comment, glyphosate's an herbicide. So, the risk isn't like we're accidentally spraying monarchs with glyphosate. It's that we're spraying their food sources. And, just want to reassure folks there too. Like the toxicity threshold's pretty high. So
we're at the top of the hour, but I'm just going to go 2 real quick questions and then we'll finish up for today. Has there been any research on ways sod farms can incorporate these practices? Where I'm located in Minnesota, a majority of our agriculture is sod farming.
it's a great question. I
Yeah,
don't know
that
the
one-
answer to that. That's
That's
a
all
less
right.
conventional row crop, so we can look into it for you for sure.
Yeah, I would say
Well-
most of in our area we have quite a few sod businesses as well. I have never seen them. They've never been one to reach out about any programs or interest, and maybe that's part of keeping their areas clean, especially after they do cut that sod with seed source. But there's still always opportunity, so always willing to consider it.
Awesome. Thank you. And then last one, I'm going to read the whole comment. Great positive presentation. I really needed this today. Prairie strips are a new term for me. Is there a seeding requirement, and how long do these need to be enrolled in the CRP program?
Yeah, so there is a seeding requirement, and that's set forth by the NRCS standard in that practice. I would have to go back through it, but that's the nice thing in that CP43 practice, depending on what your resource concern is, right? Like I mentioned, maybe it's infield and it's one of those, almost vegetative terrace looking deals, or maybe it's a filter strip, right? Those seeding specifications are a little bit different. You've got some flexibility there. So there's options, and usually program lengthwise, it's a 10 to 15 year contract in a continuous practice.
And CP43 is like one of the only ones that allows you to turn heavy equipment around in the row if needed. So it's another benefit for farmers. But
Beautiful. I want to thank you both, Brittany and Jake, for sharing your expertise, answering questions for us. Thank you all for being here today and for participating. We'd love to have you fill out our feedback form. Alyssa's going to put that in the chat, so please click on that right now before I close the window. And we want to invite you to come to our next webinar. It'll be on Tuesday, October 28th, Native Garden Design and Climate Resilient Landscaping. We'll be joined by Sarah Ressing from Wild Ones. She's the Education and Program Coordinator. So we hope to see you in October. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks all.